I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens.
Redemption and claustrophobia are what artists understand. Not valuing
I've lived in Nebraska for most of my life, all of that time in Lincoln. I am actually a native Texan, but I think that doesn't count because I only was there for 6 weeks. I also lived in New Orleans and Shreveport, Louisiana before my family moved back here. My dad was in the FBI during the war and moved back to Lincoln when I was 3 and a half, so I was educated here in Lincoln, graduate of the University of Nebraska. And I currently teach at Doane College in Crete, Nebraska. I think Nebraska and the whole plains environment and sensibility has had an enormous effect on me. I don't know that anybody can prove this, but I feel as though there's a kind of perhaps openness to my work, accessibility that might be suggested by the landscape, by the rolling hills and the open skies. I have written a number of poems which deal with the landscape directly or indirectly, but even when I'm writing about characters, when I'm writing narrative poems, when I'm writing meditative poems, I generally have a feeling of identifying with Nebraska as this being the place where my voice rises from. And so I think it's profound, but I think it's very, very difficult to really analyze that because that goes so deeply into what a writer is and does that it's very difficult to be too specific about it. Well, certainly I think my family and my wife Francie have been very important in my writing. She's always given me the permission to go ahead and do that, even though it's not a very practical sort of undertaking. And our 2 sons have grown up around poetry and literature and so forth, so they've always given me the space that I needed and so forth. They've been when they were children, they were sometimes kept quiet in order to make it possible for me to work when I was working on something. As far as writers, I think there are almost too many to mention. Certainly a number of the great Greek lyric poets. And I've had some training in classical Greek, and I've done some translating. The poems in the Greek anthology, for example, those short 3, 4, 5, 6-line poems that just explode on the page. Poets like Sappho, for example, Plato, and a number of poets, of course, in the English tradition, a number of American poets. But I think the word influence, of course, means a flowing into. And I think a poet takes in influences, becomes a reservoir of all these streams that come in, and then shapes that new water, or whatever you would want to call it, to his own purposes, his own ends. So if a poet is any good, I think his influences are more or less embodied, although nobody really completely embodies an influence. A number of poets, Hardy and Hopkins and Yeats and Frost and certainly William Carlos Williams, just to name a few. I started writing poems when I was in high school, I think around the age of 16. I suppose I could find it if I went and looked for it. I never have. I wrote a very short 6, 8-line poem, which I sent to the World Herald. And back in those days, they had a little space in their Sunday magazine, their supplement. I think it was called the Reader's Corner. and I had that poem published, I think when I was 16. That felt really great, and I wanted to write poetry. I think I first awoke to poetry in junior high when in English class, maybe 8th grade, we read Homer's Odyssey in translation. And I first became aware of language being able to do these marvelous things, create these adventures and give these images and metaphors and so forth. I really became serious about writing poetry, though, when I got to the University of Nebraska. And I made contact in my freshman year with Carl Shapiro, and he became my mentor, and I had a couple classes with him. He was always extremely encouraging of my work, and so I owe him a lot. He's probably the major hands-on experience or influence that I've had. I met some famous writers. For example, when I went back to Breadloaf in 1960, I met Robert Frost. I met John Drury, who at that time had a blockbuster bestseller novel, Advise and Consent. I met John Chardy, the translator of Dante. And I've since met people like William Stafford. So I've known some writers, and in a few cases I've become pretty good friends with some writers. But those would be the major contacts, I would say. I was alone a lot during childhood, and I liked it that way. I liked playing inside my imagination. So maybe that slightly standoffish and observant quality might have gone into making me a writer, but I wasn't aware of really wanting to become a writer until I started reading people like William Faulkner and Frost and Shakespeare and so forth, and I thought, oh, wow, I'd love to do something like that. I think lots of different kinds of things. Sometimes I will overhear a conversation or a phrase. A lot of times it's just something that I will see. I see a lot of things commuting down to Doane to work. See a lot of things going down or coming back that eventually generate poems. In fact, I would guess I've probably written somewhere around 100 poems that came directly from just driving around. So lots of different things do. Sometimes other poems do. I might write a poem which is a sort of a silent comeback to something I've admired or something I disagree with or that sort of thing. Almost anything can become a poem. I think sometimes dreams, sometimes remembering childhood experiences. And then I think sometimes I'm not inspired to write at all. I just, like most writers, I spend more time fallow than I do actually writing. I spend a lot of time just taking in. I tend to jump. If you could track my writing of poems over the year, you would see that the poem B that follows poem A is about something completely different in a different form and so on. I don't usually consecutively write on the same subject or try to, work out an attitude toward some situation or social problem or whatever. Once in a while, I do find myself centering on a given subject. This past summer, in 48 days, I wrote 31 children's poems, and that was a wonderful explosion. But the only thing that holds those all together is the fact that they are children's poems. They're quite widely different in form and subject matter and so forth. The way that book came about was I decided to see if I could put together a book of sonnets, and so I just took a number that I had written, actually that was 2 or 3 years ago this month. I used them as the basis, and then I culled from notebooks and so on. I went back pretty far and checked over all the sonnets that I've done, that's pretty much an anthology of the ones that I like the best, not necessarily the best of them. But I was writing sonnets as early as my sophomore year in college. I remember I wrote a sonnet called Mr. Tongue Tree Telling Stories. I've lost the poem. I have no idea now what it was about. I just remember the title of the poem. I guess I don't have a method of writing. It's pretty much a matter of when the idea for the poem and when the language come to me. Wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I try to make space for that, try to allow that to happen. So I occasionally will write a poem down at work during office hours, no students are coming in. I write a lot at home. I used to write a lot at night, late at night. Typically, I'd finish a poem at 1 or 2 in the morning. I don't tend to do that anymore, and I think I write at night much less often now. I think I write in the daytime more. But I wouldn't say there's a specific way. Sometimes I'm writing it out with a pen in a notebook. Sometimes I'm at the computer. I used to work on the typewriter a lot. So I guess I don't have actually a method or a time. I would hope that I have a style and a voice, and I trust that I do, and that a reader would be able to pick out one of my poems from a poem by somebody else. I suppose that evolves and that changes gradually over the years. I've never been very deliberate about it, but I think that more or less happens to a writer, to a poet, or a prose writer, either one. I think you discover your voice when you discover your subject matter, and as you begin to broaden and widen your ability to deal with subjects, I think you become more in possession of your style or your voice. I think those two are directly connected. Somebody who will pick up a book or one of my books or an anthology and find one of my poems in it, and who will bring a certain amount of reading experience and will be able to latch on to what I'm doing and enjoy it. I think it's no more complicated than that, but I don't try to envision an audience. I don't try to envision a reader. No, I just, but I'm conscious inside my head of speaking to somebody, of speaking to a reader always, although I don't try to picture who that reader may be. I guess probably I'm thinking more in terms of performance, and so when the reader gets to the end of my poem, I would hope that he or she would say, "Ooh, wow, you know, that was well done," and then maybe go back and pick up whatever was there in terms of a message or whatever. I think I'm not very meaning-oriented. I sort of let the meaning take care of itself. I'm more oriented around the sound of the poem, the shape of the poem, whatever technical challenges or difficulties I've set up for myself, trying to solve those kinds of things. So I guess, I suppose there are meanings and messages in my poetry, but I guess I don't think about that very much. I think I would say, by all means, try and keep trying. If you really want it, you can achieve that. But there's a lot of disappointment along the way, lots of rejection. I've been publishing in a serious way, since 1966. And that's a long time. And I still get rejected more often than I get accepted. So one has to get used to that. But one can also know that if you do persist, you will get there. You will find a magazine to take a poem, or eventually a publisher to take a book. So it's a lot has to do with how stubborn you are and how strong that streak in you is to want to see yourself in print. It's a wonderful, exhilarating thing to see yourself in print. And I think that can be the thing that guides a writer who hasn't had experience being published much. Just keep trying, keep it out there. Some of the famous books in modern contemporary literature were rejected time and time again. I can't remember what the number is, but I think Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time was rejected 30-some times before it was accepted. I remember Robert Mezzi, the West Coast poet, telling me a couple years ago that his book, Evening News, was rejected 77 times before it was accepted. So you've got to want it. You've got to stick with it. I'm privileged to do it. I hope I can continue to do it and continue to find the exhilaration and the energy and so forth that I experience when I write. I don't know, it's a very hard thing to explain, but writing releases energies in you and helps you to discover things about yourself. If you are seriously committed to trying to do the best you can about learning your craft and so on and so forth, there's always an adventure of that sort. I've got 3 or 4 kinds of poems that I'd like to write. I'd like to do a poem in dialogue that didn't sound stilted or phony. Most of them do. You know, I've got some kinds of things that I'd like to do, but that's not on the front burner. It's just whenever it happens, if it happens. So just to keep writing. I just say to myself a lot of times, any kind of a poem, whether it's a short one or a long one, I'm grateful for it. It's welcome. It can knock on my door at any time. I don't know, although I think it might have had something to do with its tendency to compress things and to make things memorable, to put experience into a form that you could, you know, easily remember and recall because of rhyme or meter, or even if it's in free verse, it's fairly short, it was memorable. You know, that was, I have an idea that was part of it. And then just the wonderful concentration that goes into the average poem. And also the fact that it is so full of images. Prose tends not to have as many images as poetry. So I think it appealed to me because it seemed a way into the world, an immediate way into the world. And a way also, what all writing gives you, the opportunity to rearrange experience, to cheat a little bit, to tweak it, to tell a story, you know, to move things around. Okay, I'm putting a character together. I didn't really see this guy. What I saw was a little bit of this person, a little bit of that person, a little bit of that, and mixed them together. You know, and that's all fine if it works on the page. That's what's important. So. No, nothing in the way of projects, although these children's poems that I wrote last summer, I've been going through and sifting them and trying to judge, to get a sense of how they make a book. I'd like to start getting that out to publishers within the next several months. So I've been working on that a little bit from time to time. Other than that, it's just been really not a very productive year for me so far as my writing. I've only written a few things. But I think I'm in that fallow time that I alluded to earlier, and I think if I'm able to write 31 poems in less than 2 months, then I need to build up the resources again. So as I get older, what I do notice is that things tend to come more in a flurry for me. So I'm much more likely to write a group of poems, anywhere from 7 or 8 to 31, let's say, in a relatively short time, in the space of a few weeks or a few months. I'm going to begin with the last 2 poems I've written, just to give the audience a sense of what I've been doing lately. One of those poems is an irregular sonnet, so I'll use that to segue into reading some of the sonnets from the sonnet collection. I think I chose 7 of those. And then I'm going to read, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 of the children's poems. I tried to choose some for variety, and also 1 or 2 of them I want to read because I want to test them out and see how they sound when I read them aloud to an audience. So that's just kind of the rough idea of what I'll be doing here.
Good evening. My name is Joanna Lloyd, and I'm curator of the Heritage Room. Welcome to the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors and the John H. Ames Reading Series. The Heritage Room is a special collection dedicated to preserving and promoting works by and about Nebraska authors. Currently, we maintain a collection of over 11,000 volumes written by over 3,000 published authors. I would like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because it is through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts that we are able to bring you programs like these. You should feel that you can come in anytime that we are open to visit our collection during the public service hours for individual tours or to enjoy reading in this good reading room from our collection. Our reader this evening is Roy Scheele, who has lived most of his life in Nebraska and is poet in residence and an associate professor of English at Doane College. He has studied classical Greek, written poetry, sometimes written essays about poetry, and has taught. This year, he is making a special contribution to the Heritage Room as author member of the NLHA board. In a sense, he is reading new work tonight. Two of his most recent poems, a number of children's poems that he wrote last summer, and a group of sonnets from the ground up, his most recent book. I might say a little about sonnets. Some of you will know vastly more than what I say, but possibly others will be glad for a reminder. The sonnet is a particular kind of poem that has been written for centuries. Think of Shakespeare and Petrarch. It is in what is called a fixed form, with several kinds of requirements. For example, a sonnet always has 14 lines of certain measured lengths. It has rhyme, and the placement of rhyme is prescribed also by certain basic patterns. As to subject matter, traditionally sonnets have been about love and fame, particularly about how a poet can immortalize something or someone loved. When today's poet comes to write a sonnet, that poet has a long tradition behind him, and one of the challenges is to say things in ways that continue or comment on the old traditions at the same time as bringing something new. Tonight we may be able to see or hear ways in which Roy Scheele has taken up the challenge. Not all of the poems that he reads will be sonnets, but many will be. Enjoy them and see what they offer to us. May I introduce you to Roy Scheele.
Thank you, Joanna. How's the sound here? Is this good for me? Okay. I'm going to indulge myself in a drink of water before I begin. Well, I did something tonight that's very uncharacteristic for me. I actually planned a reading. That is to say, I planned what I would read. It remains to be seen how that goes. I'm not a very structured person normally. I'm going to read the two most recent poems that I've written. One I wrote about a little less than a month ago, and one that I just wrote a week ago today. I've still been working on it this week, and it's still kind of shifting under me. The ground is not completely solid on it yet, but I'm going to try it anyway. Then I'm going to read a number of sonnets from the ground up, as Joanna indicated, and then some poems from the children's book. I wrote 31 poems in 48 days this summer. That's never happened to me before. We have 3 grandkids, and I had been intending for some time, or hoping for some time, to write some children's poems for them. And so that happened, and it just happened in a kind of flurry or blizzard of activity. It was wonderful. There were 2 or 3 days when I wrote 4 poems in one day. And I looked like a spavined horse. I lay on the bed exhausted from it, as though I had run many miles. So that's what I will finish up with. But I will begin with a poem. I had the title. I don't usually do this. I had the title before I wrote the poem, and I thought the title was so intriguing I had better write the poem to see what it was about. But it was based on a memory from my childhood. And the title of the poem is Vic Janowitz, After All These Years, Where Are You? Most of my audience is probably saying, Vic Janowitz, after all these years, who are you? If you may remember, or you may not, that Vic Janowitz was an All-American halfback for Ohio State. And he won the big game of the year one year. And I'm taking this on trust. My mind tells me that I was 8 years old at the time. I'm not going to tell you what year that was. But he won the game for his team by kicking a field goal with about 3 seconds left in a blizzard. And I remember the picture that was in the Lincoln paper showing Vic Janowitz, who you had to take on faith. And here was this curtain of snowflakes, and he made the winning field goal. Well, I spent a large part of my childhood working things like this out in my imagination. So anyway, to make a long story short, I hadn't thought of Vic Janowitz and this game for a long time. But one of these recent snows, when I was driving down to work at Doane one day, something about the way the snow looked in the fields, it was an icy snow and the sun was glinting off patches of ice and so forth. And this reminded me of a snowfall after that famous Vic Janowitz game. That same fall, it was probably December. And so this is really about childhood memory. I'm trusting it. There's no reason that you have to. I may or may not be telling you the truth here. I'm not sure. But I'm telling you what is true for me in my memory. So whether the memory is true or not, I can't swear, but I am true to the memory that I am recording here. And this is also about the nature of memory itself, perhaps because something about driving by the field and seeing the light leap off the icy snow transported me back to that snow I went across the street to the playground to play in after the famous game when I had to reenact that in my imagination. So, Vic Janowitz, after all these years, where are you? Something about the way the light leaps off this 3 days melting February snow, this patchwork glint of ice that turns the field into a flaring, fanned-out peacock's tail, where one by one blank eyes give back the sun, takes me as by the hand back through the years, through all the snowfalls, to another one that fell one night when I was 8 years old. It must have been December. I recall just such a glinting, windswept look to it when I awoke that morning, how the snow lay hard and cratered in the crystal light, and in that brightness how I crunched my way across the street, one ungloved hand around the football's end I cradled in my arm, and stepped out on the playground's wide expanse of still, unbroken snow. I stood and stared there at the edge of all that glaring white, tossing and catching the ball whose pebble grain was a cold grit in my hands. A month before, in the year's biggest game, Vic Janowitz, Ohio State's great back, had written down like prints in snow his name in football lore, kicking the winning field goal in a storm whose swirling flakes had swallowed up the ball as it went sailing through the uprights. And here, now, in this hard, bright aftermath, I was about to recreate that game. Vic Janowitz myself, imagination supplying the fall of those large white flakes, that swaying curtain, as I ran the ball for 8 yards here off tackle, there for 3 right up the gut, relentless as the snow, a scarlet and gray ghost in my jersey, weaving among tacklers, setting up the drama of the last-ditch winning kick. So when I stepped out on that virgin snow, it was in imitation of my hero, clutching the ball, careful not to fumble, my fingers tingling in the reaching cold. I spun and wheeled and staggered to one side. With a stiff arm drove a would-be tackler onto his face in snow, went down, got up, brushed grains of ice off of my uniform, and mounted drives that always fell just short. Finally, the kick, the game now on the line. I drop-kicked the ball, having no holder, having no goalpost. I used the backstop on the playground's angled softball diamond. The ball is down. The kick is up. It's good. Oh, the elation. And with cold, raw hands, I pulled my hood over my freezing ears, my teammates hoisting me to their shoulders and bearing me away above their cheers. Well, that's, as I said, the most recent poem that I've written. The one before that is completely different in feeling, and I think it explains itself pretty well, although the title might be a little bit of a puzzler for you. It's called In Parenthesis. I saw two deer, and one right in front of me, bracketing me on one side, and then in the rearview mirror I saw a second deer, so that's the parenthesis here. But also, in parenthesis, a kind of aside here. In parenthesis. Oh, I should mention, because I'm going to use this to segue into the sonnets, I'd better mention that this is a sonnet. It's an irregular sonnet, what's called a nonce sonnet, when the poet makes up the form. For years, I've been writing sonnets that don't divide themselves into 8 lines and 6, an octave and a sestet, but that divide themselves into 7 and 7. And this is one of those poems. And it's unrhymed, except for the end of the poem, where there is a closing couplet. The closing couplet, or at least the couplet somewhere, is so strong in the sonnet tradition. I seldom write one without a couplet. In parenthesis. I saw the first doe 50 yards ahead, right after I had shifted into third as the car began to climb the long, smooth rise. Like something in a dream, she drifted by, from right to left, across the asphalt road, then up the steep bank on the other side. Her white tail flashed and vanished in the grass. I felt my hands grip hard against the wheel. Just a few seconds earlier, I thought, and her blithe ignorance of her danger might have brought us both up short. My eyes were drawn then to the rear view mirror. A second doe silently clattered on the blacktop, leapt into the grass, was gone. Okay. Now I can read from the book here, and I won't have to be shifting papers quite so often here. I've got a little script for myself here telling me some things that I want to say, which seemed like a good idea last night, but may or may not be. We'll see what happens. The first of these sonnets from this collection that was published in October of 2000, From the Ground Up by Lone Willow Press, and I'm pleased that Fred Zedek, my friend and fellow poet, publisher of the press, is here tonight. First of these is called First Sighting. This is a Shakespearean sonnet, but some of the rhymes are off rhymes or slant rhymes, and you might not, toward the end of the poem, you might not hear them as rhymes unless I pointed out to you that they are. And so, for example, I'm rhyming, and you may or may not allow this, I'm rhyming between us then and talisman, and I'm rhyming drew us on and the horizon. So otherwise, it's completely regular. And this is, I think this is Hale Bopp. I think that was the name of the comet. What was that, 4 or 5 years ago? See, some of you know what I'm talking about. Memories begins to get tricky as you get older. And how many years ago this was is always a challenge for me. And in the near term, it's a bigger challenge. Then I can tell you a lot more about what happened when I was 8 years old than I can about 2 or 3 years ago. First sighting. The comet stole through darkness to the west, above the last light's transom in the sky. The rumor of its passage laid to rest by confirmation of the naked eye. Between two tall bare trees it pulsed and blurred, seeming to thrash in place where the debris, like a waterfall too distant to be heard, streamed out behind it. And you turned to me and took my hand in yours and held it tight. There was no need of words between us then. Merely by having sought it out in flight, we had received there, like a talisman, the comet's blessing, and it drew us on, westward in its wake, toward the horizon. The next poem is called On the Drive Home, and this is one of many poems that I've written in my career that have to do with things that I've experienced in or from the car. And this was, I can't tell you how many years ago, but it was some time back. And as I was leaving work one May evening, I remarked to a colleague, "That's a classic wall cloud." And I was looking at it, and I thought it was, as far as I could tell. And I got in the car and drove around the curve coming out of Crete. And the light got really funny, and it began to hail. And then it began to rain really hard, and I'm driving along and not really thinking about it very much. And this is really a poem about mistaking what you see. You see something and you think it's something else, and it gradually dawns on you what it really is. What I thought at first I was looking at was a farmer burning brush and maybe some old tires. I took the funnel for a column of smoke, and then I said, "That is really funny looking smoke. That's weird. Oh, that smoke is attached to that cloud." And it gradually I put it together. I don't pick up on these things too quickly. But anyway, this is about encountering danger, but it's also about mistaking identity. On the drive home. Oh, the form of this is a Spenserian sonnet. So you get a kind of carryover effect from quatrain to quatrain. So you get A, B, and then you get B repeated. So you get B, C, C, D, E, E. I thought at first, some farmer over there along the Sprague Road must be burning brush, seeing the smoke rise coiling in the air, and that the rain would turn to sizzling mush his bedded coals and branches. Then a hush fell on the scene, but not another drop. I saw the plume of smoke now risen flush with the cloud's underside, where spun a top that sidled on its foot but did not stop. What trailed below it was no winding string that set the spinning vacuum on the hop, but a cloud lariat hung there twirling. Where it touched down, it threw off dark debris, too close for comfort, not 2 miles from me. This next sonnet is in a somewhat unfamiliar form to most readers. It's something that's called the Felix Stefaniel Triadic sonnet, which is a fancy name. Essentially, Felix Stefaniel is a poet, and he invented this form, if you will. And what it does, rather than having 8 lines and 6, it has a couplet in the middle instead of at the end. And so it has two 6-line sections divided by a couplet and white space. And so it's still rhyming, and you will hear that definitely, but it makes a different pattern. And I think this is the only one I've tried to write. A bridal. It seemed to her in walking down the aisle, the stephanotis trembling in her hands, that she went wading through a field of flowers, and at the thought the corners of her smile relaxed a little, and she heard the stands of grass around her part and seethe like showers. She thought of all her girlhood comeliness, how everything she'd been was summed in this. Ahead now, the exchange of gold and vows beyond the gamut's last few pairs of eyes, and then, like petals scattered under boughs, the bland confetti. She herself the prize, a flung bouquet taking its tumbling boughs, and in her wake, the turning heads and sighs. All right, well, if Felix Stefaniel can come up with can invent a sonnet, I said to myself, so can I. Actually, I kind of came upon this form by accident in the writing. I didn't plan a form and then write the poem. I discovered the form as I was writing it. I don't know what to call this. I don't have a name for it. Really have to come up with a form if I want to advance this very far in the literary world. But it has an inverted rhyme scheme. It does have an octave and sestet, 8 lines and 6. But it just reverses its rhyme scheme. So you get A, B, C, D, and then you reverse that coming out, D, C, B, A. And then in the sestet you have E, F, G, and again reversing it, G, F, E. It's called Light Snow in a Drought Year. It had felt like and looked like snow for days before it started down one afternoon, a few flakes at a time through sunlit air. At first the only way that you could tell was not by looking downward as it fell, but up into the fine-spun maelstrom where the flakes came flying out like chips of stone or like a chaff driven before your gaze. And so, all afternoon into the night, it lightly fell the next morning too, and through the afternoon till nearly dark, an inch or two, no more, its highest mark. And where it lay in shadow it was blue, and bleak gold in the level last of light. What are we picking up?
I'm not sure.
I decided to read the title poem of the collection. I don't think I'll have trouble doing that. We had a wonderful cat. It was a family pet for 19 3/4 years. His name was Gandalf. And his kidneys gave out on him in September, and it was getting to be too hard to watch. And so I took him over and had him put down. But this is a poem from some years before, and as he grew older, the Christmas tree, which always interested him, became a little less interesting each Christmas, but he still had this vestigial thing. He'd give it a really good, thorough whiff. When he was a kiddie, he'd jump into the tree and knock it over and things. But he still was after that news, that intelligence of birds that had been there. And so this poem is about that, from the ground up. Here, at the base of the tree, stands water like a woodland pool, reflecting the lights and the fine needles of the lower limbs. This is the part the cat likes best. He leans in, needle showering under the green, sniffs along those branches for the still, unseen but redolent whiff of departed birds, paws at the trunk, then laps up water with quick back scoopings of his ladling tongue. The birds that dot the tree as ornaments still tempt him, even after all these years, but he knows better than to strike them now. They but confirm what he knew anyway. There were birds here, but they have flown away. That's an unrhymed sonnet, by the way. I realize I didn't say anything about its form, but of course it has that almost indispensable couplet. I don't know where English poetry or poetry in English would be without the couplet. It is the chief way we have of summing up and of compressing and so on. Of course, you can get briefer than that. You can have a couplet as a whole poem, but you can also have a one-line poem. Although when I told my advanced writing class a couple of weeks ago, you could have a one-line poem and then said one. One of the girls turned to me and said, "That's not a poem." So maybe I stand corrected on that. I'm not sure. But the couplet is marvelous because it sort of cinches things up. And it's really indispensable to, I think, indispensable to the sonnet. This last one is another Spenserian sonnet. And this was written, I don't do this very often, this was written for a contest. And the subject that was set by the contest was to write a sonnet on a color. So this is called Black. Dark as the inside of a glove is dark. A space articulate of absence tell the flesh of probing fingers like a spark shall arc across the void of space to fill and make the leather once more supple. Chill, chill as a chisel's edge in its attack upon the stone that yields by holding still the ring of oil dull silver and cold black. Slack, like the water of a tide pool, slack the shallows coiling in the dead of night, yet reassuring as the slightest crack lets in around the door a wedge of light. Implosion's color, in whose wide embrace there's no exclusion and no pride of place. The poem the second poem that I read, the poem about the deer, in parenthesis, shows that I'm still trying to do sonnets, and I can't imagine that I will stop that process. I was interviewed before this reading by Doane, and I mentioned to her, I can still remember the first sonnet I ever wrote, and it was while I was an undergraduate student at the University of Nebraska, which takes into consider I could have been a number of ages because I was an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska for a long time. I graduated from high school in 1959 and got my BA in classical Greek in 1965. But in my own defense, I was working full-time all but 1 year of that time, so as well as going to school. I can still remember that title. It was Mr. Tongue Tree Telling Stories. I have no idea what this poem was about, who Mr. Tongue Tree was, whether the title had anything to do with the poem. In those days, very often my titles didn't have much to do with the poem, but it's one of those quirky things that you remember. Little bits of useless information. But who's to say it's useless? It may come in handy someday. It's hard to know. I would not be in a hurry to say that it would never come in handy. The poems that I wrote this summer were just a wonderful source of fun for me. First of all, I'd never written that many poems in such a short period of time. Secondly, there was something wonderful about being extended by these poems, to write 4 in one day, and then 2 days later, I think it was, to write 4 again. Not to be worried about whether they were any good, not to be worried about critical considerations whatsoever, simply to be doing them and to have the feeling that you were open wide to any suggestions from anywhere in the universe, and all donations would be gladly accepted. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I came up with a title for the collection before I came up with the collection. I still don't have the collection definitively decided upon, but I'm almost sure that the title that I've chosen is something that I'm going to stick with. I'm calling it Just Whatever I See, and the subtitle is Poems for Children of All Ages. And I'm trying to cheat a little bit there because, you may have seen that sometimes, though, on children's books on the back. There'll be a little notation once in a while on an anthology, all ages. And so I'm hoping to convince a publisher somewhere that might be true. I hate the idea of this poem or this story or whatever is written for ages 3 to 5 or whatever. I think we shortchange children a lot, and it's okay if they don't understand what's going on some of the time. I just make that kind of pitch for the poems at the beginning here. If some of them seem to you to be beyond a young child's imaginative grasp, they may well be. I'm not worried about that at this point, and it remains to be seen what editors will tell me. I haven't had the book out. One of the poems I wrote early on, it wasn't the first one. I'm probably going to use this as a frontispiece for the collection. It's called With Eyes Wide Open, and it's a tiny dialogue where you have two speakers going. And I imagine this as a child and an adult. With eyes wide open. What are you doing? I'm looking around. But looking for what? For what I've not found. And what might that be? Just whatever I see. Here's a poem that I'm new to the children's poetry game, and I sent some things out to a magazine called Highlights for Children. There are not that many children's magazines around, I've discovered. And I got rejected, and I was kind of put out by it. And that usually doesn't happen to me anymore, but I guess maybe because it was a new kind of rejection. It wasn't the old kind of rejection. But Francie encouraged me to go right back to the same magazine, and so I did. And they took this poem I'm about to read here, and I think this probably will be the first poem in the collection. We go to visit our older son and his family in Boston, in Jamaica Plain. And this was a couple trips back. This is an apple tree right there in somebody's small front yard in Boston. If somebody said, by the black wrought iron fence in somebody's small front yard, there's a stunted apple tree, limbs propped up on either side to help it to bear the weight of so many ripening apples. The apples are fat, and some are already turning red, and one's leaning out on its branch above the fence and sidewalk. It's to look at, not to touch. But if somebody said I could touch it, twist it on its stem, and pick it, I think I would. On the trip to Boston this past summer, our granddaughter, Nina, was helping her mommy water one morning, and this poem is the result of my just sitting around and watching that. This has a running title, so the title runs into the first line. It's called This Morning. This morning, Nina's helping Mommy. They fill her watering can green and round as a melon from the rain barrel's water. The basil gets a soaking in its terracotta pot. It needed just a little water, but it got a lot. Mommy goes down the rows beneath the cedar fence. Nina stoops, she pours and pours, an empty pot is drenched. Mommy at last is done. The mulch is a deeper red. The hem of Nina's dress is soaked. There's water on her head. Actually, I didn't write about that, but she was completely naked by the time she was running around the backyard carrying her. Had to strip off completely because she had everything soaked. This is one I wrote for our own children many years ago, sometime in the 70s, probably early 70s. I think, if I remember correctly, I think this was written in Colorado, in Estes Park. Used to be called One for the Kids, which I thought was a pretty dumpy title, actually, and I've changed it. It may not be better now, but I like it better. It's called A Staggering Load. Bumblebee, stumblebee, tumbling the heads of the lighter flowers so patiently for hours and hours, tipping them over out under the sun and never once fumbling a single grain of the shiny pollen from daisy or clover or the poppy whose head is deep and cratered. Now he comes rumbling over a flower rim with a staggering load, every sweet hair of him. This next poem, I need to sort of forewarn you, or you'll wonder what's happening. Toward the end, there is a stretch of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5 lines where all the words are hyphenated. So if I speed it up, it's not because I'm short of oxygen and I'm trying to finish in time or something here. It's just because. But this is a thing that I know all of us remember from childhood, and you get this is one of the things from childhood that you remember because you're reminded every day during the summer. This is the ice cream wagon going by through the neighborhood, and it's called Clang Clang. The ice cream man rings his bell and drives on by. Oh my, I dash upstairs for money. It's funny. But by the time I'm back outside, his truck has glided far, far down the clanging block, chock full of fudgesicles, popsicles, dimes and nickels counted out will get you one to have some fun with, mouth-freezing summertime delights. Every parent probably would accept a nickel for every time he or she has heard this next expression. It's called, we're bored. There's nothing to do? Well, listen, you two. You, Sarah. You, John. Go play on the lawn. Take the pictures you've drawn and make up a book. Or go have a look at the stones in the brook and see how the sun throws their reflection like shimmering coins as the water runs on. Or maybe you'd like to put cards on your bike wheels, and when they strike, what a flapping there'll be. Or you could help me and take out the trash. Or try for some cash to build up your stash with a lemonade stand, or play in the sand. Or think how the stars as they turn leave no scars. Leave the dark as it was. Or with tissue and comb and a matchless aplomb play, there's no place like home. Or go for a walk. Or just sit down and talk. But I would prefer, for the rest of the summer, not once more to hear that you're bored. What a bummer. This next one is in 3 sections, and one of the sections is written in quatrains, and the second section is in free verse, and the third section is in really narrow gauge free verse, so that they look different on the page, they sound different. Almost ever since we've lived in the house where we live now, in the summertime we have blue swallowtail butterflies. And some years Francie has brought in the caterpillars and helped them, assisted them by giving them the wherewithal to undergo their change. So this is kind of my leafing back through that memory. This is probably a poem that would be objected to. I don't know whether it will go into the manuscript or not. I thought I'd read it anyway. It might be objected to on the basis of its being too difficult for children. I don't think so, but it might be objected to on another basis, but not because it's too difficult for children. But anyway, the blue swallowtail, caterpillar. One of my favorite butterflies is the blue swallowtail. The female lays her eggs on the feathery leaves of the dill, where they hatch in perfect disguise, as dots that hold so still no casual passing glance can discover their presence at all. Soon, under cloud-building skies, pure appetite reveals in their fat, rippling sides how intent and extensive their meals. For each day they double in size, add new color and detail. They're green, black, and yellow, and about to fall under a spell. Chrysalis. As if they'd woven tents of silk that suddenly hardened into jewels, green, thimble-sized, with small gold dots, the caterpillars have undergone their stunning change to pupae. Butterfly. Now, how it happens, no one knows. The tent is rent, the jewel shattered, this one emergence all that mattered. Wet wings unwrinkle, jet black, deep blue, the dew of birth beginning to dry. See how the wings work back and forth until this creature stutters off. Look, it can fly beneath a cloudless and deep blue sky. And I'm being kind of playful in the next one. Through the year in a few haiku. Winter. Under the full moon, over the crusted snow, two trembling rabbits go. Spring. The robins are back, looking dapper in red waistcoats and dark gray tails. Summer. Cricket. All night long you rub your thorax, stroking music from your side. Fall. Look, in the gaps of the fence, a flock of sparrows. No, just leaves in the wind. And back to winter. Again, the full moon. Again, the crusted snow. There are 5 rabbits now. And I suppose one cannot write a collection of children's poems without feeling the impulse to be at least a little bit of a teacher, of a sage, wise passer on of experience. So I suppose I get into that a little bit in some of these, and probably not very wise, but this has to do with the near and the far. This has to do with longing for romantic places to the point where you can't see where you are. You can't really see what's under your nose. So that's what this one's about. It's called All Around. Samarkand, Timbuktu, Petra, and Kathmandu. Do such far place names call out to you? To me they do. And I imagine caravans, mountain snows and desert sands, can see it all right where I stand. On the other hand, there's much to gain while standing here from looking closer at what is near, till all around grows sharp and clear as in a mirror. Which I think we all ought to get together and change that word to something else. That's a hard word to say. Mirror. Mirror. Mirror on the wall. To me, it's in the same league with murderer. The murderer stood and looked at himself in the mirror. Oh, well. This next poem is based on somebody's memory of something that she did as a child, a favorite activity. Of course, I don't know exactly what she did, so I supplanted my own experience here. But this one's called For Me Alone. The leaves fell, yellow, orange, and red, covered the ground like a quilt on a bed, and then got raked up into a pile. There was no wind, so they stayed a while. And then I saw them. They seemed to be lying there patiently waiting for me, and me alone, piled high as my waist, and I thought of the smell of them in my face. And suddenly over me came the feeling I had to dive into them, send them reeling. And so I backed up, took a breath as you do before diving, gave a shout as I flew in their general direction, and leaving my feet, laid out on the air and felt the pile greet my arrival with crackling, a great whoosh of air. And I came up again with leaves all through my hair. When I was done, the leaves were all scattered, but I'd had great fun, and that was what mattered. And when I came in, I had to change clothes, and part of a leaf was still stuck to my nose. There's some terrible off-rhyming there. And since this was part of that summer thing that I was doing, I let waist and face go. I said, okay, that's close enough. And clothes and nose, it's all right. This last one is called Earthbound, and it's, I wrote it just before a funeral service for somebody that we knew, and the funeral was at 10, and I started writing this at 9:10, half dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed. I started writing this, and the race was to see whether I could get this together before the draft, before we had to go to the service. And I did, and I haven't changed it. I think I changed a phrase or two maybe, but basically I haven't revised it. So it's a strange poem for me because it's one of partial elation. The subject matter is a child swinging. This was a subject suggested by Francie. But then this is tempered by this fact that I was about to go to the funeral service, and I wonder whether some sense of that didn't work itself into these lines. I'm not sure. Anyway, I like the poem a lot, so I'll read it. It's called Earthbound. Higher and higher, my feet in the sky, somebody catching me on the fly and pushing again. In either hand I feel the strain of the swing's long chains. Tipping my head back, pointing my toes, the air in a rush round my ears and nose. Above me I see a few bright clouds, untethered and free, as I'd like to be. Well, that's all I have. Thank you very much.